The All-or-Nothing Armour Scheme was a change in battleship armour protection that was started by the United States Navy in the years just before the First World War. The idea was to concentrate all the belt and deck armour in a vital citadel covering the ship's propulsion and magazine spaces, thus allowing more protection to these areas for the same weight as the older classes, which had the belt and deck armour thinning out beyond these areas, but covering most of the rest of the ship with various thinner plates of armour. Despite how it may sound, the idea was not entirely new. In fact, it was a return to the original armour principle first used in ironclad warships. When armour was first introduced, the concern was larger guns being able to punch holes in the side of wooden ships, along with the first explosive shells which could blow large sections of the ship's side apart and set them on fire. The first true ironclad, the HMS Warrior, solved this issue by putting all the engines, and as designed all the guns, in an armoured box in the middle of the ship that was big enough to keep the ship afloat even if both ends were full of holes and flooded. However, as the ships became more complex, more systems were added, and vital equipment would no longer fit in the Citadel box. Additionally, the superstructure of the ship began to grow higher and higher. This meant that some systems were now vulnerable to incoming fire, and more advanced high-explosive shells could start significant fires that could cripple or destroy a ship given enough time. Because the main armor-piercing shells would come from a few large guns in these later ships, and the secondary batteries would mostly be throwing out high-explosive shells, the Citadel armor was gradually extended to cover more and more of the ship with reduced thicknesses of armor. This was because small high-explosive shells could then be made to detonate by fairly thin armour, and due to their small size, even small armour-piercing shells would struggle against even a few inches of armour. This then protected much greater portions of the ship against the majority of incoming shells. As time went on and secondary batteries got larger and more effective, this spread-out armour increased to compensate, whilst the main belt also had to deal with bigger and bigger main battery guns. Because of the massive surface area being protected, armour weight went up much faster than the weight needed for guns, so by the late 1900s, more forward-thinking designers could see a number of issues coming up. Firstly, the Dreadnought Revolution meant fewer secondary and more primary battery shells coming in, and the main belt needed more weight to be made available to cover the proper area at the correct thickness. Otherwise, they were risking the ships being crippled or destroyed by a few good hits. Additionally, the range of fighting was moving past the point where secondary batteries were likely to be able to reach the enemy ship. Secondly, armor-piercing shot had evolved beyond simple shaped lumps of metal and now included an explosive component. This had a fuse that was designed to detonate a shell a short time after it was activated, and it would only be activated by significant pressure, like the pressure of a shell travelling at several times the speed of sound, hitting a big lump of metal. The delay was to allow the shell to hopefully penetrate the armour before it exploded, thus doing the maximum possible damage. If the shell did not meet such resistance, it would not explode. It was realised that all the thinner armour was doing was providing just enough resistance to initiate the fuse, but absolutely nothing to actually stop the shell going through, and so guaranteeing that the shell would explode inside the ship. Thirdly, main battery high-explosive shells were now so much larger and more powerful that there was a good chance they could batter their way through thin plate anyway, and the British had developed a semi-armour-piercing shell called CPC, which was effectively a high-explosive shell with limited armour-piercing capability. Combined with the previous point, there was a real danger of the thin plate being exploited to allow the enemy to deliver several hundred kilos of explosive to the inside of the ship. Fourthly, due to the extremely long range of combat compared to previous decades, and the other issues in the first point, it was far likelier that few shells would hit, but each would be individually far deadlier. To exploit these reduced chances, shells were far more likely to be armour-piercing, which could then get deep enough to cripple the engines or detonate the magazines with a single hit, compared to high-explosive, which tended to have contact or short fuses that were thus less likely to get far inside the ship and cause instant devastation. Seeing this, the American ship designers led the way in revising the armour layout of ships to more closely resemble the original style. With all the armour weight concentrated in the main belt and deck, the ship's citadel could be made stronger for the same proportion of displacement dedicated to armour. It also meant that a heavy shell hitting the end of a ship would be more likely to simply pass through without detonating. It also meant that any high explosive impacts would only have hull plating to destroy, as opposed to driving large fragments of armor plate deep into the ship, which would then be an additional complication. It also meant that the main belt could be made taller, which allowed it to join up with the main deck armour to reform the old armoured box idea, with enough volume inside to fit the ship's vital systems. This design standard was widely adopted by the other navies during or after the First World War, and the lack of battleship building experience in this time was what led to the Bismarck not having this included in its design, which was a significant contributor to its loss as outlined in the video on that ship, and which we'll be covering in a couple of months' time in a lot more detail.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.